The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $90 on a raw, gray March morning in 1971 at the Washington County Farm Equipment Auction held on the old fairgrounds lot 2 miles east of Marietta, Ohio, where the Muskingum River runs down to meet the Ohio. $90, not $900, not $9,500, $90. And when the number landed, Roy Dell Hartwell heard the laugh before he turned to find it, a short, hard laugh let out through the teeth, the kind of laugh that travels down a chain-link fence and turns the heads of every man leaning on it. The laugh belonged to Carl Brunderman, the biggest used truck dealer in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of 50-some years in a brown checked sport coat and white loafers, a man who sold shined-up diesel rigs off a gravel lot on Route 7 and who had driven out to the auction that morning in a new yellow Cadillac to pick over the scrap. Carl jabbed a thumb toward the truck Roy had just bought and said it loud enough for the crowd. $90 for a rolling tetanus shot. He said the old fool had just paid $90 to haul his own coffin home. The men along the fence laughed with him because Carl was prosperous and Carl was loud, and that is how it goes at an auction on a cold morning. Roy Dell Hartwell did not laugh and did not answer. He was 61 years old that spring, a lean, long-armed man, 6'1" in his boots, with a gray brush of hair under a sweat-darkened brown felt work hat, deep creases burned into a sun-browned face, and pale blue eyes that did not move off the truck. He wore a faded blue chambray workshirt, buttoned to the wrists, dark canvas duck trousers, and oil-blacked lace-up boots, and there was grease worked so far under his nails that 40 winters of lye soap had never gotten it out. Roy ran a one-man wrecker and repair garage down on Front Street, had run it since before the war, and he had come to the auction for exactly one thing, and he had gotten it for $90. The thing was a 1948 Diamond T-Wrecker, a medium-duty hauler built in Chicago by the Diamond T Motor Car Company, the outfit they used to call the Cadillac of trucks for the chrome and the lines on them. This one was no Cadillac anymore. The deep maroon paint had gone to chalk and rust scab. The chrome grille was pitted brown, 2 tires were flat on their rims, and the cab smelled of mouse nest and river damp. But under the bed sat a Holmes 480 twin-boom wrecker rig, the real article, 2 booms that could swing independent to either side, and beneath the rotted hood was a Hercules inline 6, a 236 cubic inch flathead, the 6-volt system, corroded green. Somebody had hand-painted the word junk across the driver's door in White House paint, and under it, in smaller letters, the price the county wanted to be rid of it for. Nobody else had bid. Carl had not bid. Only Roy had raised his hand. What none of them knew, what Roy himself would not know for 18 more years, was that the old Diamond T was carrying a secret welded up inside it, the belongings of a man who had drowned in the Ohio River 34 winters before, sealed away by hands that could not bear to open them, and that $90 truck would one day carry a lost man home. Roy towed it down to Front Street behind his other wrecker and let it sit in the side yard through the spring while he worked the jobs that paid. People asked him why a man with a good rig already would spend even $90 on that. Roy would say Diamond T was built better than anything coming off the line now, and that a Holmes 480 was worth the 90 by itself in parts, and that was true, but it was not the whole of it. The whole of it was that Roy Dell Hartwell could not stand to see a good machine die in a field, and he had been that way his entire life. He knew the iron because he had grown up under it. He knew that the Hercules 6 was a stout, slow-turning engine that would run on poor fuel and outlive its owner if you kept oil in it. He knew the 6-volt system needed clean, heavy cable and tight grounds, or it would fool you every time. He knew the Lockheed hydraulic brakes and the vacuum booster, the 4-speed crash box behind the clutch, the leaf springs you could rebuild with a forge and patience. And he knew the Holmes 480, knew how the twin booms rigged and how the drag winches pulled, because he had recovered wrecked cars out of ditches and off the riverbank with rigs just like it since 1939. Carl Brunderman did not let it go. All that summer of 1971, whenever Roy hauled a recovery up Route 7 past the dealership, Carl would step out from under his banner of plastic flags and call across the road. He called the Diamond T the Antique. He told his customers loud that Hartwell down on Front Street was running a museum piece because he could not afford a real truck, and he offered more than once in front of people to buy the old wreck for scrap weight and put the old man out of his misery. Roy would lift 2 fingers off the wheel in something that was almost a wave and drive on. He answered Carl the only way he ever answered anything, which was with work. And the work came, because Roy was good and Roy was cheap, and Roy showed up. Through the 70s, he pulled stuck grain trucks out of bottom fields in the spring mud. He winched a school bus back onto the road grade after a January ice storm, with both Holmes booms set against each other for the lift. He dragged a hay baler out of Duck Creek and a manure spreader out of a ditch, and twice a car out of the Ohio itself off the Front Street ramp where the current undercut the bank. The old Diamond T did all of it on its original Hercules 6, and the Holmes rig he kept greased and true. He repainted it once, a plain working green, but he left the white junk on the door. He said it reminded him what people knew and what they didn't. There was one job men still talked about. In the wet October of 1976, a loaded gravel truck went off the Devola grade above the Muskingum Lock and hung half over the bank with its nose down toward the water and 20 tons on its frame. 2 of the bigger county wreckers came and looked at the angle in the soft ground and would not commit to it. Roy backed the $90 Diamond T down the grade, set wood under the outriggers, and rigged both Holmes booms with the drag winches, doubled through snatch blocks, so the pull came in low and even. He brought that gravel truck up the bank an inch at a time over 2 hours, the Hercules 6 lugging steady, and the leaf springs flat under the load, and he never once spun a tire or popped a chain. The men who had walked away from it stood and watched a 30-year-old truck do what their newer iron would not. Roy drove home, greased the booms, and said nothing. He kept the Diamond T the way a man keeps a watch he means to leave to somebody. He pulled the Hercules head one winter and ground the valves by hand and lapped them in with paste and a suction stick. He rewired the whole 6-volt system in heavy cable and soldered every ground himself, because he knew a corroded ground would strand a man on a recovery faster than any broken part. He rebuilt the Lockheed wheel cylinders, set the vacuum booster right, and packed the winch worm gears in the Holmes rig with fresh grease every spring. The truck never left him stranded, not once in 18 years, and that was not luck. That was a man who understood the iron. By the early 80s, the trade had changed. The new diesels came in, and Carl Brunderman had a lot full of them, financed to the rafters. He bought a big hydraulic wrecker, a new one, all chrome and warning lights, and he photographed it for the newspaper. But the new rigs threw codes nobody local could read, and the parts came slow and dear from the city. And Carl had borrowed against everything to carry the inventory. When the freight slumped and the interest rates climbed, the loud man on Route 7 went quiet. In the spring of 1984, the bank padlocked the gate on Carl Brunderman's lot, and his new hydraulic wrecker, the one from the newspaper, sat dead with a blown pump while the bank decided what it was worth. They called Roy Dell Hartwell to tow it. He came down with the $90 Diamond T and hooked the Holmes booms to the dealer's dead modern truck and dragged it off its own lot, slow, up Route 7, past the torn plastic flags, and he did not say one word about it, then or ever. That should have been the end of the story, the junk truck outlasting the flashy man, the old iron proven right. But the real story, the one the title promised, did not begin until 5 years after that, on a cold afternoon in November of 1989, when Roy finally pulled the welded toolbox apart. The toolbox was a heavy steel box mounted to the driver's side frame rail behind the cab, the kind every working wrecker carried for chain and shackles. Roy had used it for 18 years without ever getting the lid up, because the lid had been welded shut, a crude bead run all the way around the seam by somebody in a hurry a long time before Roy ever owned the truck. He had always meant the box to hold his rigging, and that November, finally fed up reaching for chain in the cab, he took a cutting torch to the old weld to free the lid. He expected the box to be empty or full of rust. It was neither. Inside, wrapped in waxed canvas and oilcloth gone stiff as board, sat the belongings of a man. Roy lifted them out one at a time on the cold concrete of his shop floor. There was a brass river compass, a heavy marine compass in a battered brass case, its glass crazed but whole, the card inside still swinging free. There was a waterlogged logbook, its pages swollen and fused, the ink run to ghosts. There was a bundle of letters tied with string, the paper brown and soft, and there was a photograph, water-stained at the edges, of a young man in a pilot's cap, standing on the deck of a river towboat, and behind him, on the pilot house, a name. Roy Dell Hartwell sat down on an upturned bucket and did not move for a long time. He had spent 18 years cursing that welded lid. He understood all at once that somebody had not been hiding tools. Somebody had been sealing away a grief they could not carry and could not throw in the river either. He worked the find the way he worked everything, slow and careful. The logbook he dried a page at a time between blotters and weighted glass, and where the ink survived, he read the watch entries of a towboat pilot working cold tows on the Ohio. The brass compass he cleaned with oil and a soft rag until the maker's name came up on the dial. The letters he eased apart with a butter knife and patience, and they were from a wife to a husband working the river, and they were signed with a first name and sent to a man at the Marietta Wharf. And the photograph, once he got it under good light, gave him the towboat's name lettered on the pilot house and, faint on the back in pencil, a man's full name and a date in the winter of 1937. That date was the thread. Roy was old enough to remember the flood of 1937, the great Ohio River flood that drowned the valley that January and February, the highest water anybody had ever seen, that put the river up over the wharf and into the second stories of the town. He remembered the towboats fighting the tows in it, and he remembered that men had been lost. He took the name from the back of the photograph down to the county library and the newspaper morgue, and in a brittle 1937 paper, he found it. A towboat pilot, 31 years old, swept off the deck and drowned when his toe broke apart in the flood current below Marietta. His body never recovered, a wife and a small daughter left behind on Harmar Hill. And then Roy understood the truck. He went back through what he knew. The Diamond T wrecker had belonged before the chain of farm sales that ended at the $90 auction to the drowned pilot's own younger brother, a salvage and garage man who had used that very wrecker and its Holmes booms to drag the riverbank for weeks after the flood, looking for a body the river would not give back. The brother had recovered the only thing the river returned, the pilot's gearbox off the wrecked boat, and inside it the compass and the logbook and the letters and the photograph. And the brother, unable to bury a man he never found and unable to throw the man's life in the water, had sealed it all in the toolbox of his own wrecker and welded the lid down and gone on living with it, riding behind the cab until he died and the truck was sold and sold again. The grief had ridden 18 years with Roy and 34 years with the river before that, and Roy was the one who finally opened it. He could have kept the brass compass. It was a fine old marine instrument and worth real money to a collector, and no living soul would have known. Carl Brunderman would have sold it the first afternoon. Roy never considered it. The compass was a dead man's, and a dead man's people were what Roy went looking for next. It took him the better part of that winter. He read the letters by the lamp in his shop. Slow, the way you read something that is not yours, and from them he built the man back up. The pilot had run cold toes down to the locks and back, weeks at a stretch on the water, and the letters from his wife counted the days and told him about the baby on Harmar Hill learning to walk on the porch boards, and asked him, every letter, to mind the high water and come home. The last letter in the bundle was dated the second week of January 1937, just before the river rose, and it was the only one he had carried back unread, still folded, because the flood had come and there had been no home to carry it to. The wife in the letters was gone, Roy learned, passed in the 60s, but the small daughter, who had been learning to walk on the porch boards on Harmar Hill in 1937, was alive. An old woman now herself in her late 50s, living up the Muskingum at McConnellsville, who had grown up without a father and without a grave to visit because the river had never given her one. Her name was in the letters, the same name the pilot's wife had used for the baby. Roy found her through the church she belonged to, and on a clear, cold Sunday in early 1990, he drove the $90 Diamond T up the river road to McConnellsville with the brass compass and the dried logbook and the letters and the photograph wrapped clean on the seat beside him. He was not a man for speeches. He stood on her porch with his felt hat in his hands and told her plainly that he had bought an old wrecker for $90, and that it had belonged to her uncle, and that her father had been a river pilot, and that he had found her father's things sealed inside it after 53 years. Then he gave them to her, the compass first, into her 2 hands. The old woman held the brass river compass, the last thing her father's hands had set a course by, and she wept the way people weep when a wound that old is finally allowed to close. And she told Roy that she had nothing of his, nothing at all, not so much as a grave, and now she had his compass and his hand in a photograph and his wife's letters and the very book he kept his watches in. The river had taken the man and given back nothing for 53 years, and a $90 junk truck had been carrying him home the whole time. She offered Roy money. He would not take $1 of it. He told her The truck had already been paid for, $90, and that it had carried her father long enough, and that bringing him home was not a thing a man took money for. He drove back down the river road in the old Diamond T with the empty toolbox behind the cab, and for the first time in 18 years the lid sat open and free. The brass compass sits today on the mantel of a house in McConnellsville, where a pilot's daughter kept it until her own passing, and her children keep it now. The one true relic of a man the Ohio River drowned in 1937 and would not return. The logbook and the letters are with it, dried and pressed flat and read until the family knew them by heart. The photograph of the young pilot on his towboat hangs framed beside the compass, a face the family had nearly forgotten and now will not. Carl Brunderman never got his lot back. He worked out his days selling cars for another man on a different lot and died without ever knowing that the $90 rolling tetanus shot he had laughed at on a gray March morning had been a hearse and a homecoming all along, carrying a drowned river pilot down the years toward the daughter who had nothing of him. Roydell Hartwell kept the Diamond T running until the day he died. He never sold it, and he'd never repainted over the white junk on the door. And when people asked him about that word, he would tell them plainly that the cheapest truck he ever bought had carried the most precious thing he ever hauled, and that a man should be careful what he laughs at, because he never knows what is welded up inside it. We tell ourselves that the worth of a thing is settled by the men who bid on it. But maybe the truest worth of a thing is not in what it costs, but in what it carries, and in whether a patient soul ever takes the trouble to find out. So tell me, when you pass the rusted-out thing the whole crowd is laughing at, do you laugh along and walk on with them? Or do you raise your hand, pay the $90, and go quietly find out what is welded up inside?